June 3, 1944, Camp Aliceville, Alabama. The heat rose from Alabama clay like visible prayer, distorting air and certainty alike. Behind triple rows of barbed wire, 6,000 German prisoners of war waited for a future they could not imagine. Among them sat Hauptmann Werner Vogel, former music critic for the Berliner Tageblatt, a man who had written 300 reviews praising Aryan musical supremacy and condemning what the Reich called degenerate jazz. His hands, unmarked by manual labor, had held fountain pens that shaped public opinion about culture and civilization. Now those same hands held a cotton-picking sack, harvesting crops in a land his propaganda had taught him to despise as mongrelized chaos. That Saturday evening, as cicadas began their twilight chorus, Vogel heard something that would dismantle 38 years of certainty in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. A harmonica playing the blues. Not German folk melodies or military marches, but bent notes that seemed to contain multiple pitches simultaneously, rhythms that pushed against meter rather than reinforcing it, and a feeling, raw, honest, inexplicable by his musical education, that made his chest tighten with recognition of something he had spent his career denying existed, the sound of sophisticated emotion expressed through music he had been taught to call primitive. Werner Vogel's credentials were impeccable by Nazi standards. Doctorate in musicology from Heidelberg University, 20 years as critic for Germany's most prestigious arts newspaper. Published author, The Decay of Western Music, How African Influences Corrupt European Tradition, 1938. He had written approvingly about the Reich's purge of jazz from German culture, praised the 1938 exhibition of degenerate music that mocked Gershwin and Bernstein, and advocated for musical nationalism that elevated Wagner while condemning anything touched by Negro influences. His war service was clerical, Wehrmacht cultural officer, organizing concerts for troops, ensuring military bands played only approved repertoires. He never fired a weapon in combat. His capture in North Africa came when his headquarters unit surrendered without resistance to British forces in May 1943. By June 1944, he had been transferred to American custody and shipped to Alabama, a state whose racial segregation would have pleased his ideological superiors, though he did not yet understand that irony. Camp Aliceville housed primarily Afrika Korps veterans, professional soldiers from Rommel's divisions, U-boat crews, Luftwaffe personnel, educated men, many from middle and upper classes, indoctrinated but not stupid. The Americans treated them according to Geneva Convention protocols. Adequate food, medical care, recreational facilities. The camp even had a theater where prisoners staged German plays and concerts. Vogel organized the camp orchestra, 35 musicians playing Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert on instruments provided by the YMCA. They rehearsed in the evenings, performing every Sunday afternoon. The music was technically proficient but emotionally hollow, Vogel thought privately. They were going through motions, preserving culture out of desperation to maintain identity. The music reminded them of Germany, of civilization they believed they represented, but it no longer moved them, perhaps because they no longer believed in what it was supposed to represent. The camp was located near Aliceville's black neighborhood, sharecroppers and laborers living in conditions that shocked even prisoners from Nazi Germany. Poverty that made German wartime rationing look comfortable. Yet on Saturday evenings, music emerged from those unpainted wooden houses. Guitar, harmonica, sometimes just voices and rhythmic hand-clapping. Music that carried across the Alabama heat and penetrated the barbed wire. Vogel had heard this music before, briefly in Berlin nightclubs before the purges. He had written dismissively about it. Primitive wailing lacking harmonic sophistication or melodic development. But he had never really listened. Now, with nothing else to do, nowhere else to be, he listened. And what he heard contradicted everything he had claimed to know. The harmonica player was a man named Robert Lee Johnson, no relation to the famous bluesman, but carrying the same musical DNA in his breath and fingers. He worked in the camp as civilian laborer, part of a crew that maintained facilities, delivered supplies, did work the guards considered beneath military personnel. He was 50-something, bent from decades picking cotton, with hands scarred by labor and eyes that had witnessed things Vogel could only read about in his sociology textbooks that explained racial inferiority through pseudoscientific frameworks. Johnson played during his lunch break, sitting in the shade of a maintenance shed just outside the main fence. Prisoners working nearby would stop, initially to mock, then to listen, then finally to sit in silence as the music washed over them. The harmonica, a cheap instrument anyone could afford, produced sounds that seemed impossible from such simple construction, bent notes that vibrated between standard pitches, creating emotional ambiguity that major and minor scales could not capture, rhythms that swung, that breathed, that pushed and pulled against the beat, rather than marching mechanically with it. Vogel watched from a distance initially, maintaining the detachment of the critic. He analyzed what he heard using European music theory, IV chord progression, 12-bar structure, call and response patterns. But the analysis felt inadequate, like describing a thunderstorm by listing atmospheric pressure changes. The facts were accurate but missed the experience. What disturbed him most was the sophistication he could not deny. The blue notes, those pitches bent between major and minor thirds, were not wrong notes played by untrained musicians who did not know better. They were deliberate artistic choices that expanded harmonic vocabulary beyond European tonality. The African-derived rhythmic patterns were not primitive, but complex, polyrhythms and syncopations that required musical intelligence equal to any Bach fugue. And the emotion. The blues carried sorrow without self-pity, hardship without surrender, protest without bitterness. How did Johnson, a man with no formal education, no access to conservatories, no training in composition theory, create music that expressed emotional complexity Vogel had never heard in Brahms or Wagner? It was impossible according to everything Vogel had been taught. Yet his ears could not deny what they heard. One afternoon, Vogel approached the fence when Johnson played. "Excuse me," he said in halting English. "That music. What is it called?" Johnson looked at him. Enemy soldier, member of a regime that would have enslaved or murdered him, and answered simply, "The blues. Music about being human when the world don't want you to be." That definition haunted Vogel. Music about being human when the world don't want you to be. He had written thousands of words about music's purpose: to elevate the spirit, to reinforce cultural identity, to separate civilization from barbarism. But this was something else. Music as survival, music as testimony, music that insisted on humanity precisely because it was denied. He began studying the blues with the same rigor he had once applied to Wagner's leitmotifs. He borrowed a guitar from a fellow prisoner who had played in cabarets before the war. He tried to replicate what Johnson played on harmonica. It was humiliating. A doctorate in musicology, unable to bend a note correctly, unable to feel where the beat flexed, unable to express emotion without drowning it in technical correctness. Johnson noticed his efforts. One day, during a break, he approached the fence. "You playing it too German," he said with a slight smile. "Blues ain't about playing it right. It's about playing it true." Vogel did not understand the distinction. "Is there a difference?" Johnson laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement. "All the difference in the world. Right means correct. True means honest. You can play every note correct and still be lying." This concept violated everything Vogel's education taught. In German music pedagogy, correctness was honesty. Precision was virtue. Deviation from the score was failure. But Johnson was suggesting something radical, that emotional authenticity mattered more than technical accuracy, that a wrong note played honestly was better than a right note played mechanically. Over weeks, Johnson began giving Vogel informal lessons through the fence. Not formal instruction, no written exercises, no theory explanations. Just play what you feel. Don't think about what the note should be. Feel where it wants to go. It was maddening. Vogel kept asking for rules, structures, frameworks. Johnson kept responding, "The rule is there ain't no rule except be honest." Other prisoners noticed Vogel's obsession. Some mocked him. Herr Doctor learning Negro music? What would Goebbels say? Others were curious. A few joined the informal lessons. The camp's cultural officer, a lieutenant named Schmidt, who had been violinist in Munich, initially forbade these interactions. Inappropriate fraternization with racially inferior laborers. But the camp commander, Colonel Anderson, overruled him. "If music keeps them peaceful and productive, I don't care what kind it is." So the lessons continued. Germans learning blues, learning to play true instead of right. The transformation was not instantaneous. Vogel spent months fighting his training, trying to unlearn correctness to find truth. His fingers knew where notes should be according to European temperament. Teaching them to land between those notes, to bend and slide and waver, required rewiring his musical brain. But gradually, something shifted. He stopped trying to control the music and started letting it speak through him. The first time he successfully played a blues phrase, a simple 12-bar progression in E, with properly bent thirds and sevenths, Johnson nodded approvingly. There it is. You found it. Vogel felt something he had not felt since childhood. Pure joy in making music, unencumbered by criticism or comparison or competition. Music as communion rather than performance. But this joy was complicated by growing awareness of what it meant. If blues was sophisticated art, if Robert Lee Johnson was a master musician despite having no formal training, then everything Vogel had written, everything he had advocated for, everything he had helped the Reich accomplish by validating cultural purges, it was all based on lies. The degenerate music he had condemned was actually more sophisticated, more emotionally mature, more musically innovative than the tradition he had championed. The weight of this realization crushed him some nights. He lay in his bunk, surrounded by sleeping prisoners, and confronted the truth. He had been propagandist for evil. Not just politically, he could rationalize political errors as misguided nationalism, but artistically, he had used his expertise to suppress and denigrate music that was objectively excellent. He had lied, not through ignorance, though ignorance played a role, but through willful blindness. He had heard jazz before writing against it, had heard blues before condemning it. He had simply chosen to deny what his ears told him because acknowledging it would undermine his ideology. Lieutenant Schmidt confronted him one evening after rehearsal. "You're embarrassing yourself and the Reich, learning Negro music from a laborer. Have you forgotten everything you wrote?" Vogel met his eyes steadily. "No, I remember everything I wrote. That is precisely the problem." The other prisoners were divided. Some, particularly younger ones, were curious about what Vogel was learning. Others saw it as betrayal, not of Germany necessarily, but of whiteness itself. In the rigid hierarchies of military life and racial ideology, learning from a black manual laborer violated every protocol. Vogel was asserting through his actions that Johnson had something to teach that German conservatories did not. That was revolutionary. That was dangerous. Word of Vogel's transformation reached the camp's educational officer, Captain William Hartley, who was responsible for the re-education program. The U.S. military had implemented psychological warfare strategies designed to denazify prisoners through exposure to American democracy, culture, and values. Most prisoners resisted. They saw it as propaganda, brainwashing, victor's justice. But Vogel's voluntary interest in American music suggested a different approach. Hartley arranged for a phonograph and collection of blues records to be brought to the camp. Robert Johnson, Bessie Smith, Lead Belly, Blind Lemon Jefferson. The music was performed primarily by Black Americans, which made it controversial even among American authorities. This was 1944, segregation was legal, racial discrimination was normal, and many white Americans would have shared Nazi disdain for black culture, if not the genocidal conclusions. But Hartley understood something important. If you wanted to challenge Nazi racial ideology, you had to demonstrate that inferior races produced culture equal or superior to Aryan achievements. Blues was evidence, not theoretical arguments about human equality, but empirical proof that artistic genius emerged from communities Nazis classified as subhuman. The phonograph sessions became weekly events. 30 or 40 prisoners would gather, listening to records that many found shocking, not because they were poorly performed, but because they were performed so well. Bessie Smith's voice carrying pain and power that made Wagnerian sopranos sound emotionally constipated by comparison. Robert Johnson's guitar work displaying technical sophistication that rivaled any classical guitarist. Lead Belly's rhythmic complexity demonstrating that simple folk music was neither simple nor folk, but carefully crafted art. Vogel provided commentary, explaining what he was hearing. Notice the use of minor pentatonic scale with added blue notes. This expands harmonic possibilities beyond major-minor tonality. Notice the polyrhythmic structure, multiple rhythms layered simultaneously, creating complexity that European music theory barely acknowledges. Notice the vocal techniques, melisma, slides, shouts, moans, that carry meaning beyond lyrics. Some prisoners remained skeptical. "It still sounds primitive to me," insisted Schmidt, but Vogel had an answer now. Primitive means primary, fundamental. Blues is primitive the way mathematics is primitive, essential, foundational. We build complicated structures on top of different foundations, but their foundation is not inferior, just different, and in some ways more flexible, more emotionally honest. The arguments continued late into Alabama nights. Music theory became philosophical debate, became political confrontation. Because acknowledging blues was sophisticated meant acknowledging Black Americans were fully human, and acknowledging that meant confronting what Germany had done to other inferior peoples. The music forced the question. The psychological impact rippled through Camp Aliceville. Vogel was not the only prisoner struggling with cognitive dissonance between ideology and reality. Many had witnessed atrocities on the Eastern Front, villages burned, civilians murdered, Jews rounded up for resettlement that everyone understood meant death. They had participated or remained silent. Now, far from the war, they confronted what their participation had enabled. For some, blues music became pathway to larger reckoning. If they had been wrong about Black Americans being culturally inferior, maybe they had been wrong about Jews, Poles, Russians. Maybe the Reich's entire racial hierarchy was fiction designed to justify atrocity. The music forced honesty because it could not be explained away. You could deny witness testimony, Allied propaganda. You could rationalize political decisions. We didn't know, but you could not deny what your ears heard. Robert Johnson's Crossroad Blues was either sophisticated art or it was not. And if it was, then everything justified by racial supremacy crumbled. Other prisoners retreated further into ideology. They stopped attending the phonograph sessions, dismissed blues as primitive noise, and accused Vogel of being brainwashed by Jewish-controlled American propaganda. Lieutenant Schmidt organized a counter-concert, purely German classical music, performed with rigid correctness, designed to remind prisoners of their cultural superiority. It was well performed, but emotionally dead. Several prisoners left mid-concert and went looking for Robert Lee Johnson to hear him play harmonica. This split in the camp created tension. Colonel Anderson worried about violence, but Vogel suggested something, a concert combining blues and German classical music. Not competition, but conversation. Bach and blues, Beethoven and spirituals. Show that both traditions could coexist, could inform each other, could be appreciated without claiming supremacy. The proposal was controversial. White civilians in Aliceville were horrified. Germans and Negroes performing together. It violated social order, but Anderson saw strategic value. The War Department wanted denazification to succeed. If music could accomplish what lectures and films could not, genuinely changing prisoners' racial attitudes, then it was worth controversy. He approved the concert, set it for September 1944, in the camp's theater. German prisoners would perform Bach and Brahms. Robert Lee Johnson and other Black laborers would perform blues. Then, most controversial, they would perform together. St. Louis blues arranged for classical instruments. Bach's Air on the G string played with blues phrasing. It was either brilliant or disastrous. They would find out soon enough. Vogel, tasked with arranging the music, felt the weight of trying to bridge 3 centuries and 2 continents with 12 bars and bent notes. Rehearsals were tense. The German musicians brought technical excellence but emotional rigidity. The blues musicians brought soul but limited formal training. Neither group trusted the other completely. Robert Lee Johnson and the German violinist, a man named Hoffman, who had played with the Berlin Philharmonic, argued over tempo for St. Louis blues. Hoffman wanted strict 4/4 meter. Johnson insisted it needed to swing, to breathe. "Music ain't a march," Johnson said. "It's a conversation." Vogel mediated, trying to translate between musical languages. He explained to the Germans, "Swing rhythm is not imprecision. It's a different kind of precision. Precision of feeling rather than precision of notation." He explained to the blues musicians, "Classical training is not rigidity. It's discipline that allows freedom. You learn the rules so thoroughly you can transcend them." Both sides grudgingly respected Vogel because he spoke both languages now. He could play Bach fugues and blues shuffles. He could analyze harmonic progressions and feel where a note should bend. He had become translator, mediating between traditions that had been artificially separated by ideology. The breakthrough came during a late-night rehearsal of the hybrid arrangement. Bach's Air played with blues phrasing. Hoffman played the melody straight, correctly, beautifully, but it was just notes. Johnson suggested, "Try bending that third a little. Let it cry." Hoffman was offended. "You do not bend Bach. Bach is perfect as written." Johnson smiled. Bach was human. He cried too. "Let the music cry," Vogel intervened. "Try it just once. What if Bach had known about blue notes? What if he had heard blues? Might he have used them? Hoffmann reluctantly attempted it, playing Bach's melody but bending the third degree down slightly, creating that characteristic blues sound. The effect was startling. Suddenly the Baroque melody sounded mournful, human, emotionally immediate. It was still Bach. The structure remained, but it spoke differently. The other musicians stopped playing, listening. Hoffmann played it again, bending different notes, adding slight slides and vibrato he had been trained to suppress, and tears ran down his face. "Mein Gott," he whispered. "I have played this piece 1,000 times, but I never heard it until now." That was the moment. Not the concert itself, though the concert would be significant, but that rehearsal, when a German violinist trained in rigid correctness learned to let Bach cry, when technical mastery merged with emotional honesty, when two musical traditions stopped competing and started conversing. The other prisoners who witnessed it understood something had changed, not just in the music, in them. The concert was held September 16, 1944. Audience included prisoners, guards, camp staff, and, controversially, black laborers who were normally not allowed in the main theater. Colonel Anderson had to obtain special permission from the War Department. Local white civilians protested, but Anderson stood firm. "If we're fighting for democracy, we can at least let people hear music together." The program opened with German classics, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms. The prisoners played competently, preserving culture they believed was slipping away from them. But the music felt like museum exhibit, beautiful but lifeless, preserved rather than living. The audience applauded politely. Then Robert Lee Johnson and 3 other black musicians took the stage. Just guitar, harmonica, washboard, and voices. They played Crossroad Blues, St. James Infirmary, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen. Simple instrumentation, but emotional depth that filled the theater more completely than the orchestra had. Vogel watched the German prisoners' faces. Some were moved despite themselves. Others remained skeptical, convinced they were witnessing primitive entertainment rather than art. But most were simply confused. Their categories were breaking down, their certainties crumbling. Then came the hybrid pieces. St. Louis Blues arranged for string quartet and harmonica. The Germans played the structure while Johnson wove blues phrases through it, creating something neither purely classical nor purely blues but both. Then Bach's Air on the G string, with Hoffmann playing melody with bent notes and blues inflections, while the blues musicians provided rhythmic foundation. The effect was uncanny. The music should not have worked. It violated rules of both traditions. But it did work. It worked because it was honest. It acknowledged that both traditions were incomplete alone, that each had something to offer the other, that music's purpose was not to prove cultural superiority but to express human experience. The audience sat in stunned silence when the music ended, then applause, tentative at first, then building. The black laborers applauded the Germans. The Germans applauded the blues musicians. Some prisoners were crying, not from sorrow but from recognition of something they had lost and were just beginning to recover, the ability to acknowledge beauty outside their ideological framework. Lieutenant Schmidt stood abruptly and left the theater. He could not accept what the music proved, but others stayed, asking questions, wanting to understand. Vogel spent 2 hours after the concert explaining blues theory to prisoners who weeks earlier would have dismissed it as primitive noise. The concert changed nothing politically. The war continued. Germany was still losing. But it changed everything personally for men who had been trapped in ideology and were finding their way out through bent notes and syncopated rhythms. News of the Aliceville concert spread to other POW camps. The War Department, recognizing its psychological warfare value, encouraged similar programs. Blues musicians were invited to perform at camps across the South, Tennessee, Georgia, Arkansas, Texas, not just as entertainment, but as deliberate challenge to Nazi racial ideology. Some programs failed. Prisoners remained hostile, dismissive, but others succeeded beyond expectations. Vogel became unofficial consultant for these programs, traveling under guard to other camps to help organize concerts and explain blues theory to skeptical prisoners. He was uniquely qualified, a Nazi music critic who had publicly recanted his views, who could speak to German prisoners in language they understood while advocating for music he once condemned. His reputation in Germany was destroyed. Articles he had written were cited by Allied prosecutors at Nuremberg as examples of cultural complicity in Nazi crimes. His name appeared in reports documenting how intellectuals had provided pseudoscientific justification for racial policies. He would never return to his former position. His career was over, but something strange was happening. He was becoming someone new, not just changing his mind about blues, but fundamentally transforming his understanding of what music meant, what culture meant, what it meant to be human. The blues was teaching him not just new techniques, but new ways of being in the world. Robert Lee Johnson, who had inadvertently become his primary teacher, explained it one afternoon. Blues ain't just music, it's a way of surviving. When the world beats you down, you got two choices: let it kill you, or sing about it. Singing don't fix the problem, but it reminds you that you're still human, still got something they can't take. That's what blues is. Music that says, you can take everything from me, but you can't take my voice. Vogel thought about Germany, destroyed, defeated, occupied. Germans would need music like this, music that acknowledged catastrophic failure while refusing to surrender humanity. Not triumphant Wagner, not nostalgic folk songs, but blues. Music that looked directly at horror without flinching, that admitted fault without collapsing into self-pity, that found hope not by denying reality, but by insisting on dignity despite it. He began writing again, not music criticism, but something more personal, a memoir about his transformation. He called it Learning to Bend the Note: How American Blues Taught a German Critic to Be Human. He had no idea if it would ever be published, if anyone would care, but he wrote it anyway because Johnson had taught him, you sing, not because anyone is listening, but because you're still alive. May 1945. Germany surrendered. The full horror of the Holocaust was revealed through photographs, testimony, captured documents. 6 million Jews murdered. Millions more. Industrial-scale genocide. When the news reached Camp Aliceville, many prisoners refused to believe it. Allied propaganda, they insisted. But the evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from German civilians, photographs taken by German soldiers, Nazi bureaucratic records meticulously documenting every train, every camp, every murder. Vogel felt the news like physical blow. He had known about persecutions, Jews stripped of rights, businesses destroyed, people disappearing, but he had not imagined, had not let himself imagine, the systematic nature of the killing. And he understood with horrifying clarity that his articles, his cultural critiques, his intellectual justifications for racial hierarchy had been part of the machine that enabled this. Not directly. He never ordered murders, never ran camps, but he had helped create the cultural atmosphere where such things became thinkable, doable, normal. He thought about Robert Lee Johnson, about the blues, about music created by people who had survived slavery, lynching, systematic oppression, music that insisted on humanity precisely because it was denied. Germans would need that music now, not to excuse what they had done, but to find way back to being human after being monsters. He approached Johnson one last time before repatriation. I need to thank you. You taught me more than music. You taught me how to live after discovering you've been wrong about everything important. Johnson nodded slowly. That's what blues does. It's music for people who done wrong, who been wronged, who trying to figure out how to keep going anyway. Germans gonna need blues now. Maybe not my blues, but your own version. Music that tells the truth about what happened and don't flinch. Repatriation began in late 1945. Vogel returned to Germany in February 1946, to a Munich that was rubble physically and morally. His wife had died in bombing raids. His son was missing, probably dead on the Eastern Front. His career was destroyed. His reputation ruined. He had nothing except a notebook filled with blues transcriptions and understanding that culture was not property to be defended but tool for survival. He found a basement in what remained of Munich's university district and began teaching. Not in the conservatory, that was closed, compromised by Nazi associations, but in informal classes for young Germans trying to understand what their country had become. He taught them blues, music about being human when the world don't want you to be. The classes started with 5 students in a cold basement with no electricity, meeting by candlelight, because Munich's power grid was destroyed. Vogel taught them 12-bar blues progression, blue notes, swing rhythm. More importantly, he taught them emotional honesty, how to express grief without self-pity, guilt without paralysis, hope without denial. Some students were former Hitler youth, teenagers conscripted in the war's final months, now trying to understand what they had been part of. Others were children of Nazi officials, carrying shame of their parents' crimes. A few were Jewish survivors, returned from hiding or camps, searching for something that might bridge the chasm between Germans and those Germany had tried to exterminate. Vogel taught them all the same thing: blues as survival tool, as method for confronting horror and remaining human. You cannot change what happened, he told them. You cannot undo the murders, cannot restore the dead, but you can refuse to become what they became. And music, honest music that tells the truth, is how you do that. The hybrid form he developed, German classical structure infused with blues feeling, became something new. Not quite blues, not quite classical, but something emerging from ruins. Other teachers adopted the approach. By 1950, there were dozens of ensembles across West Germany playing this fusion music: Bach with bent notes, Beethoven with swing rhythm, Brahms with blue notes. Critics dismissed it as mongrelized corruption of German tradition, but younger Germans embraced it precisely because it was corrupted. Pure German tradition had led to catastrophe. They needed something impure, something that acknowledged mixture and contamination and influence from sources they had been taught to despise. Vogel never became famous again. His name remained associated with his Nazi-era writings, but hundreds of musicians across Germany considered him teacher. They called the fusion style blues classical, and it influenced the development of European jazz, progressive rock, experimental classical music in the decades that followed. In 1960, Vogel received an unexpected letter from Alabama. Robert Lee Johnson, now in his 70s, had heard about the German blues classical movement. He wrote, "Sounds like you learned the lesson. Blues ain't about where you from or what color you are. It's about being honest when lies would be easier. Keep teaching that. World needs it." Vogel kept that letter until his death in 1973. It was found among his papers, carefully preserved, annotated with a single word in German: Lehrer, teacher, because Johnson had taught him the most important lesson, that truth emerges not from ideology or tradition, but from willingness to be transformed by what you hear. The true transformation happened not in dramatic concert or public confession, but in 1,000 small moments of honesty. Werner Vogel's climax was not a single revelation, but ongoing process of learning to hear what he had spent his career denying. Each bent note was admission of error. Each blues phrase was rejection of supremacy. Each lesson he taught was repentance made audible. In 1965, 20 years after the war, a German television crew interviewed him for a documentary about cultural reconstruction. They asked the question everyone wanted answered: how do you reconcile being Nazi propagandist with teaching American blues? Vogel thought carefully before responding, "I cannot reconcile it. There is no reconciliation. I was wrong. Comprehensively, profoundly, criminally wrong. I used my education and expertise to validate a regime that murdered millions. I wrote that Black Americans were culturally inferior at the exact moment they were creating one of the 20th century's most sophisticated art forms. My ignorance was not innocent. It was willful. I heard jazz and blues before condemning them. I simply chose to deny what I heard, because acknowledging it would undermine my ideology. The blues taught me something I should have known as musicologist but ignored as ideologue: that culture cannot be property, cannot be exclusive, cannot be used to justify hierarchy. Music emerges wherever humans insist on remaining human, despite circumstances that would reduce them to less. The blues came from slavery, from oppression, from systematic denial of humanity, and from that horror came art that taught their oppressors' grandchildren how to survive their own moral collapse. I teach blues now not because it forgives what I did. Nothing forgives that. I teach it because it offers something Germans desperately need: a model for how to be honest about catastrophic failure while refusing to surrender your humanity. The blues says, yes, I did wrong. Yes, I suffer. But I still sing. That is what Germany needs to learn. Not to forget, not to excuse, but to acknowledge fully and still find way to continue being human. The interview was controversial. Some praised his honesty. Others accused him of using black suffering to absolve German guilt. Both criticisms were partly true, but the students kept coming, kept learning, kept discovering that music could be both acknowledgement of wrong and pathway forward. The climax was not resolution but commitment, to spend remaining years teaching that culture's purpose is not to prove superiority, but to reveal shared humanity. That lesson, learned from a harmonica player in Alabama Heat, became Vogel's only redemption. Werner Vogel died in Munich in 1973, at age 67, of lung cancer from years smoking cheap cigarettes in cold basements while teaching. His obituary in German newspapers was brief, mentioned his Nazi-era writings, noted his post-war teaching. No major tributes, no state honors. He was buried in a modest cemetery in Munich, attended by 40 former students and one surprise visitor, a black American jazz musician named Thomas Johnson, Robert Lee Johnson's grandson, who had traveled to Germany specifically to pay respects to the man his grandfather had taught. Thomas played harmonica at the funeral. Amazing grace, with blues inflections, bent notes turning the hymn into something both mournful and hopeful. The Germans present understood what they were hearing. Tradition transformed by contact with other traditions, made richer by contamination, improved by impurity. That was Vogel's lesson made audible. In his papers donated to Munich's Music Conservatory, archivists found the notebooks from Camp Aliceville, transcriptions of Robert Lee Johnson's harmonica playing, attempts to notate rhythms that resisted notation, margin notes questioning every assumption he had held. Also found every article he had written during Nazi era, carefully preserved with annotations. Wrong, wrong, wrong. He had not destroyed the evidence of his crimes. He kept it, studied it, used it to remind himself what happens when ideology overrides evidence, when culture becomes weapon rather than communion. The blues classical fusion he pioneered influenced generations of European musicians. Without using that specific term, they absorbed the lesson that music's power comes not from purity but from synthesis, not from exclusion, but from embrace, not from protecting tradition, but from allowing tradition to be transformed by encounter with other traditions. Robert Lee Johnson never left Alabama, never traveled to Germany, never saw the full impact of what he taught. He died in 1958 at 73, still working as laborer, still playing harmonica on breaks, still teaching anyone who would listen that music was about being honest when lies would be easier. His grandson carried that teaching to Germany, then to France, then across the world. The blues, born from slavery's horror, became medicine for other horrors, teaching that survival requires both remembering and continuing, both acknowledging and transcending. Werner Vogel's transformation was not redemption. Some crimes are too large for redemption, but it was proof that learning is possible, that ideologues can become students, that even those most trapped by lies can, through music, find their way back to truth. War changes men, nations, and truths. A German critic learned from a black laborer that culture is not proof of superiority, but evidence of shared humanity. If this story made you reflect on how art transforms, how listening can be revolutionary, how beauty emerges from unexpected places, share it. Because what we learn from music, if we truly listen, changes not just what we know, but who we are. And sometimes the most profound education comes from those we were taught to ignore.